Hi everyone. So we ran a cracking webinar last night called Bumps, Babies and Baggage. We had a little bit of an issue with the recording, so I'm back here now to take you through the content. I'm going to get out of the way in a minute and I'll bring up the presentation and I'll take you through it all. I'll answer a bunch of the questions that actually came up during the session as we go, as well as coming back on like this to finish that off at the end. So let's get stuck in. Okay, so it might be worth grabbing a pen and paper. There's some super practical tips coming up in terms of a few things, and we'll also do some calculations that you might want to jot a few things down there. Just before we do, they're all our socials. That's the Sufficient Funds handle, Road to Sufficient. I'm on TikTok if you want to check that out. TikTok was actually one of the inspirations for this session because I put a video up there that went a little bit viral, for my standards at least, and that was one thing that kicked off a bunch of the content in here because it was so important, and it became more obvious how important it was as I saw some of that eventuate. So let's get stuck in. So as the name suggests, really this session is focused heavily on educating as many people as we possibly can, really on how to financially handle what can be an incredibly challenging time for many different reasons. So before we go any further, I just want to thank Glenn James, a massive thanks to Glennie J and JP and the crew at My Millennial Money, of course, for collaborating with us on this event today. And look, it's a very important topic for so many of our combined communities in dealing with this type of thing. We really appreciate the support of the M3 crew to share this with as many people as possible. So I wish to acknowledge the Awabakal people, traditional custodians of the land on which I'm standing today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. A couple of disclosures. Number one, this is general advice only. It's not personal advice. If you do need personal advice and this kind of topic will uncover a bunch of reasons for that potentially, then you can absolutely reach out. We've got some links at the end of this where you can touch base with us, and our advisors are more than happy to chat if you don't have a financial advisor that you're currently working with. Disclosure number two, really importantly, guys, I'm coming at this incredibly sensitive topic as a male. So if you're not sure what AITA means, you probably need to spend a little bit more time on Reddit. Please do not get your financial advice from Reddit, however. So this is a photo of me asleep while my wife was in labor. Tash was in labor with our first child. Now, whilst I'm never going to experience all the aspects of the babies and bumps topic, what I can and will bring to this is deep and personal experience in a bunch of areas, and that includes planning a family, fertility issues, supporting my wife through pregnancy, major pregnancy complications and supporting extensive time in hospital, pregnancy loss. I'm a dad to two IVF kids, IVF babies who are now 5 and 6 years old. We've had babies in intensive care, daycare and school transitions are now relevant. And of course, in financial planning around these topics for hundreds of clients of Sufficient Funds over the last 5 or so years and beyond. So I also want to acknowledge while we're here that as we've been through some really tough times ourselves around all of this, I know deeply that this can be an extremely emotional time for a lot of us, and as well as an incredibly costly time. So if you are struggling with any of this, I just want you to know we are thinking of you and really do wish you all the best in the journey. So I'm the managing director and one of the financial advisors at SF. I'm incredibly privileged to work with countless young people in building financial plans around these big decisions and everything else that life throws at us during this stage. And as you can see from the slide, we help driven millennials move beyond sufficient funds so they can smash their goals and make their dreams a reality. So in line with that, I want to make sure you all get the most out of my time and out of this session. So we got a bunch of questions, and I did ask everyone on the webinar to add as many questions as possible in there. And look, the great news was, and what I was really asking for at this point in time was, what do you want to get out of today? What do you want us to cover off on? And what was really good about that is what came out of it was basically everything that we were about to go through. And look, that was lucky in a way, but it's also the fact that we have such a deep understanding of what's required and, you know, what people are dealing with because we've been through it all ourselves. So things came up like government parental leave. Yes, we're going through that in detail. Other things like what does work leave look like? Can I have that? And the government leave? What about going back? What are the childcare costs? What are the biggest, most unexpected costs? All of that type of thing. So we'll cover pretty much all of what came up in those questions under 5 stages. So it's trying to conceive, it's being pregnant, it's birth and setup costs, the time off work, and then returning to work. So let's get stuck in. So trying to conceive, really for a lot of people, this part, it's effectively free and it can be super fun, right? But for others like us, there is an unknown cost to getting pregnant. And this can be one of those very difficult, almost impossible places to actually set a budget. Actually, just a quick side note while we're here. If you're planning to deliver through private hospital and you don't yet have private health cover, there will likely be a 12-month wait on pregnancy claims. And I think you'll struggle to find a policy where that's not the case. So ideally, if you're starting to think about all this stuff, that you have this kind of cover in place before getting pregnant for that very reason. So we all know starting a family is not the best financial decision you'll ever make, but that's not the point, right? I'm a money nerd, and this is one area where the numbers, as long as you have a rough idea is sufficient, should absolutely not dictate your decision. So starting a family might just be the beginning of the single most fulfilling part of your life. This is one of those areas where you do, of course, you want to be as financially prepared as possible, and that's what we're here for today. But in the end, unless you're swimming in debt and, personal debt like credit cards, and you're not making ends meet yourself, given the gravity of what we're talking about here, I think you are going to be likely to move mountains to be able to make it work. So for those who do need it, what we do know about fertility treatment is that it is all highly individualized. The formula, quote unquote formula, that works for one person or a couple might not be what works for the next. And, in fact, we've all had friends and they all go through different parts of this, right? And you would know that. No, in fact, our client demographics are actually so wide and varied that during the defining sufficient sessions that we hold and our annual check-ins with clients, we've actually discussed and planned for all of the above. All the options. So there's fertility treatments, of course, there's egg freezing, there's donor, there's surrogacy, and adoption, and so forth. So the costs for all of this can vary. And obviously you may actually need to use multiple avenues. So we got really lucky with our 2 kids. Without delving into all the detail, the eggs and the sperm, they were in good shape. So this part worked for us, and IVF was actually our ticket to having our 2 kids. At the moment, IVF, one cycle costs a bit over $5,000 up front at most private fertility clinics. And then medications can cost maybe another $2,000 or up to $2,000 on top of that. There are some government incentives, and some states, I know, for example, in New South Wales, you could potentially reduce that down to about $1,000 at select public clinics. Really importantly, that was the first round of IVF. The second and beyond, if you need them, you'll pay a little bit less for those, and then you can halve that cost again if you have a number of frozen embryos that could be implanted if prior attempts weren't successful. Interestingly, and you may have heard this, you can also pay for IVF with super. Now, this is not financial advice. Definitely seek advice if you're even contemplating going down that path. But factually, it works out under the condition of release that's known as compassionate grounds. And so that's a consideration, and it's probably good to understand, especially if you're going through a stressful time financially around all of this, as well as obviously emotionally dealing with it all. Egg freezing is another thing we see all the time. I've seen many clients whose plans we've included having kids one day, but the circumstances right now don't necessarily align with that. And so, or doing it right now. So, interestingly, and you may be across this already, but the Medicare rebate and also some public hospital access, it's only going to cover egg freezing if there's a health risk to fertility. And that might be something like endometriosis that my wife's dealt with, or cancer. So elective egg freezing does come at full cost through private providers. And I mean, I had a client go through this recently. It was about 6,000 or 7,000 in the end. Now, surrogacy is a much bigger deal in terms of costs. Surrogacy is something that does come up. We've dealt with that once for one client who's actually gone right through that process. You're talking about maybe $100,000 at the moment, which equates to about 150,000 Aussie. So for some, or for a lot of people, that's going to be completely out of the question. For some people, it's certainly a consideration. Actually, really interestingly, in the chat last night doing this webinar, we had someone note that they know the industry fairly well, and there is a lot of talk and some groundswell now around this of surrogacy options being more local options, and there's been a bit more pressure around that, which I would say would highly likely also reduce that cost as well. So watch this space perhaps there. Adoption is another one. So adoption locally, you might be up for about $3,000. Inter-country adoption, maybe about $10,000, plus things like travel, citizenship costs, and so forth there. On the inter-country note, I think it's about 13 countries where you can adopt from as an Australian. And that includes parts of Asia, includes parts of Europe predominantly. The one challenge with adoption and surrogacy, I think, other than the cost, of course, is that timing and maybe long queues and delays can also play into that as well. So all things to really be aware of. So pregnancy is the last chance to save. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the financials and what you probably need to be aware of in terms of saving. But if you're pregnant now, or you're just about to be, I mean, ideally you've got 9 months of pregnancy, or at least 8 months by the time you've found out. And this is your time to get saving if you haven't already. And so while pregnancy might be close to free, having the baby and setting up at home for their arrival definitely does cost. So I've been doing a bit of talking already. I'm going to pause for a second here because this is where we had a couple of questions come through. So I'll just note one of these that came through at this point, and we'll deal with a few other questions towards the end. But one through the Q&A was a question around IVF payment through super. And the question was, is there a limit to what's covered? Which is a really good one, because what it is it's actually driven by the invoice. And so taking money from super, you have to meet a really, really strict condition of release. And in terms of super payments, it comes down to, for IVF, will come down to an invoice from the right registered relevant medical professional. And what they look at there is covering just the out-of-pocket costs. Obviously, the key there is that you don't end up with cash in the bank that's just come out of your super fund and not gone to the intended purpose. That's really important. Also note, though, on that is that IVF Australia and other private clinics, I think, also have payment plans available. So these are definitely worth checking out if you need them. But of course, anything like this is never free. So just make sure that it makes financial sense for you as well. The third stage is birth and setup. So we call this birth and setup. Birth's obviously the medical side. Setup is the stuff. And for these two, you're probably looking somewhere between maybe 3,000 up to maybe 10,000. If you're going nuts, maybe a bit more. But always remember, spend on what you value, what you actually care about. So in terms of birth, if you choose a public hospital, and you have Medicare, then costs are likely to be probably somewhere between $0 and around $1,500 out of pocket, depending on the tests and so forth. Now, our personal experience with private hospital with our chosen obstetrician gynecologist, which was absolutely necessary given Tash's history of endo, was about $5,000 out of pocket, including multiple appointments and tests throughout pregnancy. Now, a really good question came up around that. What if I go publicly, but I choose my own obstetrician, my private obstetrician? Well, that's going to be about the same. So you're still going to end up at around $5,000, because if you're going privately and you've got private hospital cover, which is incredibly important if you're doing that, and I'll explain a bit about the costs of that maybe later, but the $5,000 covers the professional that's looking after you and the multiple tests and so forth there. So onto the stuff. Now, this one, just for the giggles, $61,000 worth of pram you're looking at here. This, friends, is the Silver Cross Rose Gold Edition. So it's used by Royals and it's covered in actual gold. So you can go pretty nuts with this stuff. I also found a $10,000, $10,687 to be precise, car seat in my Googling as well. So everyone, just take a really good look at this table. What you're going to see here is what you're budgeting for. You can keep it super cheap if you're going secondhand. You can keep it still fairly cheap if you run with some of the lower cost department store style IKEA, Big W, and obviously you can dial it way up if you need to or if you want to, or that's something that's important to you. So this is kind of your birth and setup costs. And what you want to think about, we'll call this birth and setup costs, and we'll actually use this later. So jot this down. What I want you to do is think about what are you going to spend across these main 4 items, and then also think about whether you're going private or public and what that's going to cost you based on what I just mentioned there, $0 to $1,500 public, or maybe $5,000-ish privately. What's that going to put you out of cost in terms of out of pocket, in terms of birth and setup costs? So price-wise, in terms of all this stuff here, I mean, if you land in the middle like we did, it's probably $3,000 or so for these big 4 items. These are the big 4. These are the ones you just cannot leave the hospital without. And really everything else can be dealt with later. So I'll touch on that in a minute, but it does depend on how you spin it. For us, we had a $600 pram. So we kind of landed in the lower end of, we didn't go too crazy on the pram. You can spend a lot more. I see lots of people doing that, which is totally fine if that's what you want. We'd saved so much on that we ended up allocating more money to really good car seats. And so we had a bunch of car seats just between the 2 cars by the time we'd had 2 kids, just to save mucking around and save the time of transferring seats all the time. So that was really helpful for us. This bit's unsolicited advice, but we didn't go with a capsule. We just went with a car seat. We got lucky. We had kids that we could transfer. And maybe we just got lucky with that because I know it doesn't always work. But we didn't go with a capsule. We went with the 0 to 4 size car seats, and they worked an absolute treat. But I know there are many other people who would swear that the other way is the only way, and that is totally fine, of course, as well. So finally, allow maybe up to $500 for everything else. Most of this stuff, the everything else stuff, is maybe your partner's or a close friend's job, and that can be picked up super quickly and easily during the first few weeks back at home if you need it. So bonus tip here, just be really clear on things you would appreciate as gifts, especially maybe from friends and family where you can be super honest with them. Things like towels and bibs and wipes or a baby monitor, something like that can be super helpful, obviously. Way more helpful than a couple things we might have picked up, like the singing cactus toy or that noisy pink ball that screams pink cat over and over and over. It gets stuck under the lounge and you can never shut the thing up. Anyway, this is that time to be specific and be super clear with your friends and family. Be a little bit selfish here because it's important. So, parental leave and time off work, this is stage 4 before you then return to work. And this is where the costs really start to kick in. So if things are tight, you can totally manage your purchases and you can deliver publicly, of course, which, 90% of people do, I think, and it's super popular and probably the best place to be if something also goes wrong in terms of public hospitals. So they've got great NICU wards and it's a great place for most people, I think. And, for us, like I said, we ended up going privately because we absolutely had to due to health history. But, that's probably more of an anomaly for many people. So the income drop is likely to be the biggest cost that you end up dealing with. And it's right up there with things like daycare. So I'll spend a bit of time on the benefits now because this has proven to be, as my TikTok has shown me, a huge area of uncertainty for many people. So let's dive into the government paid parental leave, or what's called parental leave pay. Now, there have been a few recent tweaks to this for any child born since July 1st this year, so 2023. I'm going to assume that's where most of you are sitting right now. So let's focus there. So I did actually have a TikTok go viral recently on this, and a lot of the comments were really around how rubbish this system is, which I thought was really interesting. But it's important to remember this is basic assistance. It's paid at minimum wage, and unfortunately it's not available to everyone. So let's have a look at the detail. So you receive payment for up to 100 days or 20 weeks. So there's 20 weeks of what's called paid parental leave pay. So $882 a week is what you get. This is minimum wage, and it goes up each year with inflation. So depending on the year that you're actually looking at this, you might have a bit more there. That equates to $176 a day, or over the 20 weeks, it works out at about $17,500 or thereabouts before tax. Yeah, so that is taxable income. And to meet this, you've got to meet a few things. Obviously, you've got to be caring for the child. That's really important. The two most important tests, though, here are the work test and the income test. And you can't be claiming or working, on claim days. So really, the work test is the number one. If you can't pass this, unfortunately, it's not available. So this is where that comment on TikTok was relevant. Someone had asked me, I'm a stay-at-home mum, what do I get? And unfortunately, the answer is no parental leave pay in that circumstance. So there is some other things that might be available, like family tax benefit. And if you've already had a child and that's the reason you're staying at home, is that maybe you can get access to what's known as some of the newborn child assistance benefits that are available. So definitely check out Services Australia if that is you. But let's have a look at this. So the work test really means that the mother, so it's crucial. It comes back to the birth mother or the first adoptive parent must meet the work test. If you don't, then partner, dad, doesn't receive anything. So you need to have worked 10 of the last 13 months and have done 330 hours of work during that time period, which averages about a day a week. So it's not a huge amount as long as it's consistent at least 10 of the 13 months. A really good question came up here is, what if I've changed jobs? And that is all totally okay. That's fine. Now, really good to note, this can now, and this is a new change, it can also be shared with the partner, but they also have to have met the work test if they're going to be sharing it, because again, this is paid as income. It's income replacement. So really important to check out Services Australia if you're not sure, if you've got a bit of an anomaly situation there, because it's a great resource in terms of getting most of, and I say most because sometimes really tricky questions is probably going to require an application or a call to Centrelink to really understand it. But that is a good starting point. So income test is another one. There's some good changes here as well. So the income test has always been an individual test based on the birth mother or first adoptive parent's income, and that is still relevant here. So if you earn less than $168,000 we're looking right now, we're in early early the 2024 year. So really, if it was in the 23 year, if you earned less than 168, call it 170 grand, then you're good to go. If you earn more though, the good news, and this is another recent change, which is great, you can look at your household income for that year. So if you earn more, but your partner earned a bit less, and the combined amount, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be less, but as long as the combined amount is 350 or less, then you can still qualify. So that's awesome, I think, now. And that actually opens it up to a lot of people. So another change to note, though, dad and partner pay that some people may have heard of or capitalized on, and I know I did at the time, it used to be 2 weeks, but it's now been removed. So it's now been removed and it's combined to give the same total of 20 weeks, but where 18 of those weeks can actually now be shared fully with the partner, which is always at the discretion of the birth mother or the first adoptive parent. Now, that changes nothing really if you've got the traditional, birth mother works and dad doesn't work and dad goes back to work, if you're following that. But, it's becoming less and less common that is actually so many people are using these types of benefits in different ways now, which is really cool to see. And so there is a downside to that dad and partner pay being removed, and it's where families have a non-working, so that, like that question before, the stay-at-home mum, so to speak, if there's a non-working birth mother and the dad who does work, they're no longer able to get the 2 weeks that they would have previously received, and they also can't claim the parental leave pay from the government due to mum not meeting the work test, if that makes sense. So differently though, with us at Sufficient Funds, 75% of our clients are female. So firstly, the change to the income test to include household income has actually now meant that a lot of those mums earning over 170,000 actually still have a shot at getting this extra cash. But it also means that if the birth mother wants to return earlier to work, then the partner who may be earning less can take that extra time off with their new child and still have some income support around it. Now, better still, if there's a work from home arrangement in place, like there is at our workplace, Sufficient Funds, we have everyone working fully from home, where you can balance this a little bit. You can actually avoid the commute, enjoy more time together, and still get paid for it. So you got to be careful. You can't claim the work days. If you're actually working, you can't claim the days. But another recent change that's also been super helpful for a few of our clients is all around the flexibility of this. So this is really cool. You can actually now take this leave in blocks of as little as 1 day, and you can spread that right out between you and your partner, if you both qualify, right out until the child turns 2. So where this works quite well, and I've seen it more recently with a client, is self-employed and need to keep a business running, or able to work from home, like we talked about, and can take extra leave. And so you could be working 2 to 3 days a week maybe, and take those other 2 or 3 days as parental leave pay, and you can spread that out maybe even over 6 to 12 months or more. So this is where I stopped last night in the webinar, and I asked if everyone thought they were going to actually qualify based on the work and the income test, who was eligible. And I swear, I think we got one no out of, and we had 90 people on. So there was a huge amount of yeses flowing through. And the no was from a gentleman who I think is self-employed and earning too much as a result of all of that. But really pretty cool to see that this is actually something for our communities that is super, super helpful. Now, I get this can be a little confusing. So if you've got questions, we took a few questions around this stuff in the chat last night, but most of it I've just covered off on. But if there's anything else, of course, always shout. You can, there's a link to call us to lock in a call with any of the team. We've got female and male advisors, female and male mortgage brokers. So no matter who you want to talk to and who you think you'll click with, we can totally hook you up if you want to have a chat about some of this stuff and figure out how it might also work for you. Just remember, it all comes down to personal circumstance. So just make sure you kind of take all of this info into account. Now, let's move on to the good stuff and talk about employer-provided leave. Now, I was actually really surprised. I went to the audience last night to see if people could tell us what percentage of non-public sector employers actually offer paid parental leave, or what a lot of people would call maternity leave or paternity leave, paid leave through work when you have a child. We now call that paid parental leave through work. And look, it blew me away a little bit. Just have a think about it. Have a think about what you think that percentage is. I'm probably a bit more optimistic in terms of what businesses are offering because we do it ourselves. But generally, everyone's guesses was fairly low. But this is it. 50%, and even with public sector or government included, this only gets up to 60%. Now, I was a bit sideswiped by this when I first read it. I looked up this stat. This came straight from the government. It's the Gender Equality Government Department. And yeah, I mean, we're a small business and we offer this. We're also bringing in things like fertility leave in the coming month as part of a recent review of policies, as well as paying super to anyone on parental leave. Now, I get that those last kind of two options are a little bit more of an anomaly in the world at the moment, but I really wish they weren't. I just think, especially paid parental leave for at least for the birth mother is really, I think it's the right thing to do. And paying super obviously goes a long way to bridging the gap, or starting to bridge some of that gap of what is a very real gender pay gap. So if it's not available to you, I think you should actually start to challenge things a little bit in your workplace. And, maybe it's about timing it right, but find examples like this in your industry. Go out there, ideally with a direct competitor that offers it, and take it to your management team. Start to campaign for this. You will not be alone in wanting this stuff brought in. So I do know that quite a few bigger businesses, at least now, also offer the same, or at least something to partners, which is good. Now, if paid leave is offered, most commonly we see it around 3 months of full pay. I did note someone in the chat last night mentioned that they work for an IVF company and they only get 5 weeks of paid leave, which I thought was a bit off. Anyway, so lots of chat and lots of comments around that as well. So if you're not sure about it, just make sure you check with your work, check the work contract. It can be a bit of an uncomfortable conversation or something you want to avoid. Obviously, if you don't want to have that conversation with the boss, I'd like to think that you probably could, but unfortunately that's not going to be the case. Where I'm fully aware that not every manager is going to be up for having that discussion, or, necessarily every employer thinking that that's good timing for them. But the good news is, if you are eligible, you can claim both. So you can claim the work leave as well as the paid leave from the government. You can do it at the same time. You can do one after the other. You can spread them out, as you know, with the blocks that we just talked about. You can spread the paid government paid leave out over up to 2 years if you need to. So the message here is great for those who get it, but for those who don't, unfortunately, and that is still a lot of you, I think, you're going to need to take this into your own hands and proactively set up your own buffers for starting a family and getting through this kind of most challenging part, which is actually just getting back to work. So let's have a look at how we do it. So we are sending out an email with a link. And if you haven't got that, if you registered for the webinar, you've received that. If you haven't received that, we'll put a link in, but you can always email our team or hit us up on socials, and we'll send you a link to download our budget template, which is this. We'll also send the replay out, like I said, so you can rewatch this part if you need to. This step's really crucial. What I want you to do is complete this for your current income. So income on this section, It flows down. There's 99 lines here, so it prompts you with everything. This just shows the back end of it here. And this is all the fun stuff, the boring's above it. What you want to do is put your current income, include your partner if relevant, and your current cost of living. What you want to do is work out how much you're actually saving between now and when you might give birth. And now obviously that's going to be a guess, but you'll see the monthly and the annual amounts down here in row 99. And so what you want to do is then take that number and add that to the amount or any current cash buffers that you already have in place for this purpose. So our clients call this the baby fund. Super simple. And we're going to call it, for the purpose of today, it's actually the pre-baby fund. Yeah. So write down that number. How much do you have already for this purpose? Don't put your house deposit in. Don't put your emergency fund in. Make sure those are separate. The emergency fund especially, you want that separate. You want to keep an emergency fund. Having a baby is not an emergency. So you want that separate. Your pre-baby fund is what are you having separate savings that are allocated towards that, plus what can you save in the time between now and when you are aiming, ideally, to have a child. And so if you're thinking about starting in the next little bit, we'll maybe call it 12 months. If it's beyond that, you can call it more. But write that down now. That's the pre-baby fund. Now, then what I want you to do once you've got that number is save another copy of this, start a new one, keep the old one because that's really important. It's a good exercise to go through your cost of living anyway. I know for sure that when you keep a budget, and I know this for myself, I don't always want to keep a budget, right? And that's the money nerd speaking. However, when I do, I naturally have more money. I'm becoming more conscious of what's coming and going, and I'm aware of it. So do this anyway. But what I want you to do here now is actually change this to what is the time off? And maybe you assume it's going to be 12 months. If you know for sure that it's not, well, you can adjust that. But how much income are you going to have during that time? So you can put during this time off, this is going to be your time off cost. Put in any government leave, put any paid work leave that you're going to get. What you want to do is put in the after-tax amounts if possible. You can use paycalculator.com.au if you're ever wondering what gross income turning into net income might look like. Obviously, put your partner's pay in there as well. And then what you'll have there is your time off cost. So once you've got all of that in there, you're going to see down here again in row 99, if it was 12 months, it'll be in that annual column, which is this second one here, and that will be your time off cost. So write that down as well. Okay, so how you work this out, what you're looking at now is you want to calculate how much do you need to save before birth, and this is to get you through to going back to work. Now, you've already written these all down. So you've got your pre-baby fund amount. That's how much you were able to save plus how much you already have before you give birth. Then you've got your birth and setup costs there. So you start with the fund, you take away any birth and setup costs that you're estimating there. And then it's a plus or a minus your time off cost, depending on whether this was a negative or a positive number. And that's really important. It is possible that if the income up here is strong enough or the costs down here are low enough that you might end up, if you've got enough leave up your sleeve, you've got enough, maybe some people draw on long service leave during this time and annual leave potentially. I would say please try and use your annual leave for an actual holiday because this is not a holiday, but it's there if you absolutely need it. Then sometimes that's a positive. But I mean, if you think about an example, if you've saved, let's call this $10,000 before you have a baby, let's call this $5,000. So your birth and setup costs were $5,000. So you've then got $5,000 left. If you then have a $10,000 negative time off cost, which is that second spreadsheet that you did back here, then you're down $5,000, and that's the extra amount you need to find before you give birth. So If you're not able to earn more or save more, go back to the budget, scrutinize. Maybe that's selling a few things around the house. Maybe it's begging, borrowing, probably not stealing, but that gives you, and this is really crucial, sometimes the news, when you look at your financial budget, it's not great. But the most important thing is you actually know, because then with clarity comes the ability to make decisions. So that's crucial there. This is a part where you may get stuck. If it's positive, you don't have to worry about it. You're good to go. But if that is negative, then that's where you need to kind of maybe do a little bit more work. But obviously shout at that point if you do get really stuck. So back to work, most of our clients go back around 12 months. And it's often not full time. So think about that. Are you going to go back full time? Are you part time? Are you not at all? Maybe you're not going back until your children get to school age, potentially. There are lots of clients who run that in all sorts of different ways, and that's totally fine. If you have a partner, what about their plans? So think about all of that. This is where balance, and in a perfect world, maybe a few extra grandparents will also come into play. So, we've been really lucky. Tash and I, both of our sets of grandparents are still alive, for one, which is super helpful. But also, my parents don't live super close, but Tash's do. And that's been really helpful. I mean, even when both the kids were in daycare before Ada started school, they, even just one day a week with them, saved us 10 grand a year in childcare fees. And so it can be significant, but I will say, based on some other friends' experiences, do not overestimate the willingness of the grandparents to help out. It might actually come to us as a surprise, but they also have a life. And full-time caring for a small human isn't not necessarily as high on the list as you might have hoped. But if you do need childcare, there have been some pretty good changes to the childcare subsidy, or the CCS, which according to the government is actually now available. Good news here, 96% of families requiring childcare should be able to get that now. And that is because the upper limit of the family income has been lifted right up to $530,000. And so this is how the childcare subsidy works. Now, if you earn up to $80,000 as a family, then you get 90% of that back. It's important to remember 5% of that is withheld throughout the year and then paid at the end once it's all balanced, just to make sure there's a buffer and you don't get overpaid, because the last thing you want, just like tax, and we're seeing a bit of that at the moment this year with recent changes, you don't want to be ending up with a bill around that time. Now, between 80 and 530, it drops from 90 all the way to zero. 1% for every $5,000 of income that your family earns over the 80 grand. And once you hit 530, unfortunately, that's where it's done. But that's lifted up from the high 300s, 385-ish, I think it was last year. So a significant change, and that does definitely open it up, especially a lot of our clients are in that kind of 380 to 530 bucket. And incredibly now, a lot of them can at least access something there. And it just promotes, maybe it promotes going back to work. Maybe it promotes working an extra day. But it just allows a little bit more flexibility around that. If you need a quick run through, so there is a really simple childcare subsidy calculator on the Services Australia website, which is really good. There's also a video on my TikTok, or two videos actually, around childcare subsidy, if you want to have a look at those as well. There's a bit more detail on that. But the calculator is really helpful, especially if you've got multiple children and you're trying to work that out, because multiple children under 5 especially, so not so much for us now where we've got bush, so the after school care. If you've got 2 in actual childcare under 5 or 5 and under, you will get additional, you may, depending on your income, get additional discounts, or subsidies. So that's where the calculator is super helpful. It was also good for us because we got one in the after school care, so we've been able to kind of work that part out through the calculator on Services Australia as well. So I'm going to jump to a few questions in a second, and I'll use some of the questions that came through last night to just kind of round this out and hopefully give you as much as you can take out of this. So hopefully this has been really helpful. It's there's no doubt this is a really difficult time for planning, and it's one because there's so many moving pieces and so many unknowns, but it is one that you just want to spend a bit of time really thinking about. It's an amazing time in your life. So please stop, do some planning, get the money stuff sorted so you can go and focus on the fun. The next challenge is probably then how to fund the next child or two, should you be planning to have more. And this part actually makes up a huge part of the financial planning that we do for so many of our clients who are starting or growing their families. Obviously, having kids is only one of those many moving pieces that you're probably trying to balance. And often this time of life, as we know, because we've been there, it's why we started this business in the first place. Tash and I have been through so much of this ourselves that it just made sense to focus on this. I'm the money nerd. We can bring it all together, but ultimately it's about helping, guiding people through this stuff. And, right now it's things like first home purchases, it's home upgrades. It's maybe, can you afford to get the brand new Kia Carnival because all of a sudden you had twins and you need that extra space? Whatever it is, you really want to understand the impact of this time on cost on your longer term plans, things like your super fund, your investments, and everything else that you're hoping to achieve. So, of course, reach out if you want to discuss any of this. The team of advisors, like I said, female and male advisors and mortgage brokers, and the broking team, the mortgage brokers, are ready to go as well if you need any help there. Especially, we just did an event recently, if you have a look at our YouTube, on home loan stress and stress around that. And the guys have been super helpful in helping clients, a lot of new clients especially, find better rates in the market as well. So you can use those guys completely separately to the financial planning side or in combination with it. Of course, we work pretty well as a team, but I am biased. So let's get to some of the questions and then we'll wrap this up. All right, so let's get into some of these questions. I've just got them on my phone here, took some photos of them. So thankfully we grabbed some of these. So someone asked, were there any unexpected costs through the whole journey? And I guess what I'd say to that is, so much of it is really unexpected. You can plan for things like what you buy. You can plan for whether you're going public or private. What you can't plan for is if you struggle. And so especially around the treatments that you may need, fertility and everything else that could come into it, that's where the stuff is really unknown. And, for the most part, for the planners out there, and I know there are lots of them and lots of you out there, if you're not able to grasp exactly what that looks like, you need to get comfortable with the fact that you're setting up buffers in advance. And if not, really, the one thing we can always fall back on is so many people have done this before us, right? This has been happening for a very, very long time. And so ultimately, I think you can have comfort in that everything should be okay. It's just plan as much as you possibly can to deal with it. So what else have we got here? So family daycare and daycare in a larger centre, is the cost similar? So our experience of that and the research I've done, and I've been doing a lot of this research because I'm writing a book about a lot of this stuff at the moment. So we found that daycare itself was probably in the realm of, depending on where you are, maybe $100 up to $180, $190 a day, probably more in the middle there. And for our plans that we build with a lot of our clients, we use kind of $150, $160 a day before subsidies. And then the family daycare center, that's usually a smaller one, run individually, run separately, smaller groups. And there are pros and cons, I think. What you might find, though, in some people, and one of the comments actually in the chat yesterday was that there's no difference in cost. They actually found that family daycare in their area was actually more expensive. We actually found that in our first daycare before we moved from Sydney up to Newcastle. We were paying maybe low hundreds a day. We're paying more than that here now. However, we just got lucky there. And we did find somewhere. It was pretty no frills, but it was good. It was perfect. And they were really great. And the family daycare in that area was probably about the same. Family daycare is probably anywhere between about 80 and 110, I think you'll find. What else we got? So can you and your partner take 10 weeks of paid parental leave each, but also take it at the same time? Now, two parts to that. You can definitely take 10 weeks each. You can share the paid parental leave. It's at the discretion of the birth mother or the first adoptive parent. The second part to that, though, can you take it at the same time? Unfortunately not. You can share 10 days. You can take 10 days together, and often people do that right at the start, share that time, and then the remaining 18 weeks is left to be shared, but it's only one at a time. But that's where I was talking about earlier, a lot of that flexibility around the way to handle this, depending on who gets paid more and who's ready to go back to work. I mean, traditionally, and still, I would imagine for most people, it's the birth mother that is spending most of the time with the child. Now, the great thing is that people are much more open to that not being the case anymore. And in many cases, we see, mum earning more, going back to work earlier, or getting a work from home type scenario and running with it from there, which is really cool because there's a lot of flexibility in how you manage that stuff, especially if you've got a few buffers in place to handle that slightly lower income. Because, don't forget the parental leave pay from the government is paid at minimum wage. So that's, that's lower than what almost everyone is earning essentially. So what else we got? So there was another question here. Is private health cover actually worth it? And so, I mean, I can only speak for ourselves. I mean, if you think about private health, is it worth it for, going privately and all of that? Private health itself is a whole question in itself, right? Is private health cover worth it for anything? And really that comes back to, something we probably don't have time to dig in today. Actually, Glenn James and My Millennial Money has got a really good decision tree around it. But often what we find with clients is the cost of private health is negated by the tax saving that they get by not having to pay that extra levy. And so that's a key consideration for a lot of people. The long-term loading after you hit 31 and beyond kicks in as well. But I mean, thinking about private health for us, it was incredibly important. My wife, when we were pregnant with our second child, she ended up having a major hemorrhage. And so 4 weeks before Eden's premature birth, he was born about 5.5 weeks early. She ended up in hospital and we just had to drop everything. And so there was about a month in hospital, and then he was born early. So he ended up in special care for another 3 or so weeks. And so in this time, I mean, we had an incredible saving. We had private health cover, thank God. It covered about $55,000 worth of hospital bill. And that's what it covers. It covers the hospital. So we were really lucky there. Now, it really comes back to your appetite for risk. It comes back to what else are you dealing with? What else is going on? Can you afford it? Do you need it? And high risk pregnancy is one of those reasons that you may end up being recommended to go through the private. It might be the decision of your obstetrician rather than you, as long as you've got the money available. And so, for us, our appetite for risk for most things is pretty high. But at the time, we had a 17-month-old daughter in tow. I got the call, was 45 minutes away, and we just have to drop everything. I just picked her up from daycare. Incidentally, Sufficient Funds, the business, was 11 days old at that point in time. So that time really taught us a lot about perspective, a lot about all this stuff. Now, I really hope you guys did not have to go through anything like that. But it is a really good reflection on where private health can be helpful, because I know there's a lot of reasons not to do it, some reasons to do it, and that's one of them. So anyway, guys, I might wrap there. I think, like I said, you can always reach out and chat to us if you need to, if you want to discuss a bit more of this stuff in detail. I really hope that's been super helpful. Please give us feedback. We're going to send out a survey to anyone who actually attended the night But feel free to shoot us an email with any thoughts, anything we could have done better, anything that you liked about it. Would love to get some feedback, and we'll be conducting many more events in the future. So probably see you there. Thanks.